Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Omar Shakir, who is the Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch. Omar, thank you so much for joining us. We've moved from talking about the horrific attacks that were on Israel to now Israel's response. I'm curious to know where you're focusing your energies and what you're seeing as this situation unfolds.
I think the most urgent priority right now is the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We're in a situation now where the more than 2.2 million people that are effectively sealed into this 25 by 7 mile strip of territory have now gone days, many of them without electricity, without fuel. Fuel is essential not only to operate Gaza's power plant, but for the generators, which are vital for the operation of hospitals, including to run, services that require electricity, urgent life-saving medical procedures. Without water, without internet, without food, without aid, the humanitarian situation, by the minute, virtually is deteriorating, and lives are hanging in the balance. Israel's bombardment, it continues to pound the Gaza Strip. We've seen entire city blocks, neighborhoods reduced to rubble, hundreds of children and civilians that have been killed. Hamas and Palestinian armed groups have continued to fire rockets towards Israeli population centers, also creating significant havoc for communities that live under them. And of course, we're still processing the extent of the Hamas assault in southern Israel. They continue to be hostages. The number estimate continues to increase. We've heard 199 most recently from the Israeli government. Palestinian armed groups just now are saying could be well over 200. Their security, well-being is also of paramount, concern. Of course. All of this is happening not in a vacuum. I mean, Gaza has been under closure for 16 years. It's been under occupation for more than a half century. Its population has been largely refugees that have been refugees for generations. So all this is to say, our focus is obviously in the here and now, starting with the humanitarian situation, the ongoing use of force, but there's a larger context that makes it even more.
Let me because I think, first of all, let's step back to last week. In the immediate aftermath of these attacks, there were a number of groups that came out and blamed this on Israel. I just want to clarify, is there a justification here in your mind for these attacks on Israeli citizens?
No. Deliberately targeting civilians has no justification. Going to parties, infiltrating homes, shooting people in their homes, taking women and children as hostages, parading them in the streets of Gaza. I mean, some of the footage and evidence we're reviewing are truly horrific and is something that cannot be justified. They're heinous war crimes. They have no justification.
Yeah. Well, let me ask then, in terms of some of the response, and I'm not an expert on the region, but one thing I have read is that basically the conditions for, helping to return the infrastructure, water, etc., to Gaza is the release of those Israeli hostages. Is that an unreasonable request in this situation?
It is an unreasonable request because you're punishing an entire population of 2.2 million people for the actions of individuals. So collective punishment, which is the legal term for when you punish people for acts they did not commit, is actually a war crime. So to hold the entire population of Gaza responsible for the actions of members of Palestinian armed groups is a war crime, as is starvation as a tool of war. The reality here is the rules of war, international humanitarian law, were governed particularly to deal with situations like this. And the basic principle, which applies to Palestinian armed groups as well as to the Israeli government, is you must distinguish between civilians and combatants. That's the same logic that leads us to say the attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups were war crimes because they targeted civilians. It's the same thing when you take measures that cut electricity, water, all these other things for 2.2 million people. Yes, among those 2.2 million people maybe are members of Hamas and Palestinian armed groups, but half of them are children. The overwhelming majority of them are Palestinians that had nothing to do with what took place then. The response under the law to acts of serious abuse and to crimes is to prosecute and hold those people to account, not to starve a population of more than 2 million people. That is also heinous and also a war crime.
You know, one of the real challenges in this situation, I know there have been a lot of comparisons to 9/11. I don't know if you think they are fair comparisons. When you're dealing with a state, and then you're dealing with what in essence has been classified as a terrorist group, it seems like the conditions for warfare are different than when you're dealing with two countries at war with each other. Do you think that that's the case? Is that being characterized correctly here?
No, I disagree strongly. And in fact, you'll hear an argument by Palestinian armed groups arguing the exact opposite thing, which is they'll tell you, hey, like, we don't have the weapons to be able to distinguish between combatants and civilians. There's a power imbalance. Doesn't that mean that we have to use whatever means are available to us? So if there are rockets, and that's also an incorrect argument. We had an exchange of letters, in fact, with Hamas authorities making this point. The point is simple. The laws of war apply to everybody, states and non-state actors, because there are rules that govern those kind of conflicts. The minute you allow exemptions, either because of a characterization of one of the parties, or because you think your cause is more legitimate, or because you believe you have more or less power, is the minute the rules lose all of their significance. And I don't say this lightly. I mean, I represented men detained in Guantanamo Bay before I came into this role. So I've seen the horror of what it's like to create, a legal black hole, to throw the laws, outside of the book. And it never serves anybody, certainly not the affected populations on the brunt end of that, but also ultimately doesn't serve the power that does that. Because look at what's happening in Ukraine. The whole argument has been we need to defend the rules-based international order. The minute you allow for exceptions to that is the minute they lose their meaning. International law, again, just to emphasize, one atrocities by one party or war crimes by one party do not justify them being committed by the other. It's also one of the reasons why Human Rights Watch, for example, takes no position in war. We document abuses by all parties because we think it's important that that's credibly done. These rules were created to minimize human suffering, and if you throw them out the book, you've thrown the law itself out the book, and that hurts all of us.
What have you've been tracking this region for some time? As I mentioned, you are both Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch. Give us some context in the run-up to this situation. It's been maybe not relative peace, but certainly we haven't seen this kind of horrific carnage that we saw on October 7th. What was the situation from where you sit in terms of human rights abuses?
I think it's an important question you're asking, because I think it goes to show how sometimes there's information's missing. Certainly the degree of carnage is unprecedented, but actually, we've been seeing these abuses over many years. Just to take 2023 as an example, before October 7th, we saw more Palestinians killed in the West Bank than in any other year since the UN began systematically recording fatalities, right? We saw, the number was before October 7th, 180 plus. So nearly, more than one every 2 days. There are more Palestinians before October 7th held without trial or charge, over 1,300. This was according to the Israeli government statistics, than in 30 years. Gaza entered its 17th year under a closure. So certainly we hadn't seen this degree of unprecedented carnage, but Palestinians have been living under systematic repression for decades. I mean, Human Rights Watch and many other human rights organizations, have found in recent years that the Israeli authorities are committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. A Palestinian who's 14 years old has lived through, 4 or 5 major escalations, hostilities that have, in many cases, killed scores, hundreds in some cases, of Palestinians, destroyed homes, 16 years of, as I said, closure, plus 56 years of an occupation that's been repressive. So all that is to say, none of those things justify the heinous attack that took place. But the bloodshed and the repression did not start October 7th. In fact, it took place now precisely because the international community has not addressed decades-long unlawful attacks with impunity and systematic.
One of the differences that I see from where I sit is when you look at the goals of both sides, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the goal of Israel is to have some degree of peace. That's why we were seeing these, with the Abraham Accords, the regional ties with countries like the UAE, the possibility of broader ties with Saudi Arabia. The goals of Hamas has been the eradication of Israel and, pretty clear anti-Semitism. So it feels to me like the end game for each side is extremely different, and there's no world in which you would want Hamas to achieve its aims as stated. Is that fair?
I don't think it's accurate on the Israeli side, certainly, because the Israeli government speaks about wanting peace, but actually, even that rhetoric, there hasn't been genuine dialogue. I mean, the Palestinian Authority engages in coordination with the Israeli government. There haven't been peace discussions for well over a decade, and there's a consensus now, as I noted, not just Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. You have 27 Israeli groups, you have Palestinian groups, you have the former UN Secretary General, you have governments like South Africa, the African Union, that have found that Israel is committing apartheid. And apartheid is a legal term. Again, it's a legal term. And it's when you have a policy to maintain the domination by one group of people over another. And that has been the underlying analysis that many of us have reached about decades of Israeli policy, that it's primarily about, maximizing land and resources and the maximum number of Jewish Israelis as compared to Palestinians. And that lies in the backdrop, right? So yes, they have done these agreements with countries in the Gulf, but they were never at war with those countries. Those countries have had, and by the way, those countries, I've worked on some of them, have terrible human rights records. These are governments that have committed their own, in many cases, war crimes and significantly clamped down on repression. This wasn't about peace. This was an agreement between states to further their own national interests, right? On the Hamas side, I mean, look, we've documented also very serious abuses committed by Hamas. Firing of rockets towards Israeli population centers, arbitrary arrest, torture, numerous other things, right? So I think Hamas, in many ways, it's a thuggish organization. It's committed serious abuses, but Hamas is Hamas, and the Israeli government is the Israeli government. So
do you consider Hamas to be a terrorist group? I mean, just because that's how the U.S. government classifies it, is that a fair characterization?
So at Human Rights Watch, it's not unique to this context, in other contexts as well, we apply the law. And so we don't make designations around using labels like terrorist or not terrorist organizations. We didn't make one on different groups, because for us, no matter what you might characterize the organization, we're going to weigh your actions against international humanitarian law, right? And so we certainly believe that Hamas-led fighters committed war crimes on October 7th. They've done so before. They should be held accountable, and not just the foot soldiers who did it, those who ordered it, those who have carried it out. But we don't, as a human rights organization, our rhetoric is about the law. It's not about terms like terrorist or not terrorist, which, as you know, can be terms that are subjectively used by different countries depending on their own perception, of those organizations.
So talk a bit about me. I know you're not necessarily a political pundit, but I do think there is a lot of curiosity about what the end game is here. We've certainly seen signals that Iran backed, Hamas, that there could be another front opened with Hezbollah. This does seem at risk of becoming a wider regional conflict if it's not already.
Yeah, look, I mean, that dimension is certainly quite possible. I think it's important to sort of underscore a couple of things, right? The first thing is to say that where we go will be dictated in particular by where the international community, how it weighs in the coming days, because the Israeli government, especially in recent days, has signaled that they have an intent to commit large-scale atrocities. I mean, by ordering the evacuation of a million.
Well, they've not said. I mean, you think it's large-scale atrocities to basically try to protect the state of Israel and the people who are within it?
That's not what they've said. The president of Israel has said we hold the entire population of Gaza responsible. Israel's ambassador to the UN reminded people on CNN that Palestinians voted for Hamas. You have the energy minister in a statement today where he basically said in so many words that we're not going to give anybody water or electricity until we defeat Hamas. You have the defense minister that talked about human animals and cutting off Israel. The point I'm trying to make is the Israeli government has signaled that they hold the entire population of Gaza responsible for what took place, and that they're intending to carry that out through even more intense campaign. I mean, let's be clear: 1,000 kids, according to one Palestinian human rights group, have been killed in 9 days. These kids had nothing to do with what took place. The law provides guidelines for how to conduct operations. Destroying city blocks to rubble, wiping out entire families. These are not the kinds of things that are about providing security. These do not speak about accountability for what took place or security. These sound a lot like revenge and a lot like demolishing Gaza in response to what took place, and that's simply not what the law authorizes. So I think the point I wanted to make to your question is we've been disappointed, I think, as a human rights community with the ways in which the international community in the early days, they rightfully condemned the atrocities committed by Hamas, but I don't think there was enough pushback around the need to respect internet. We're talking about basic things: respect international law, allow humanitarian aid in, make sure you distinguish between combatants and civilians, do not punish the civilian population. There's been more of those statements like that from the US, from Europe in the last 48 to 72 hours, but it needs to be even stronger. The world must act, because I worry that we're going to be sitting in days and weeks and with body counts that are in the tens of thousands, and wondering if we could have done more today to stop that from happening. And I say this at the moment in which a ground invasion could be imminent any minute, or bombardment, which has already been at a scale that's, you're talking about 25 by 7 miles, 6,000 plus bombs, and these are not just, small bombs. These are have wide area effects on one of the most densely populated area on Earth. So we're talking about potential for real serious harm to civilians.
Is there a solution at this juncture? Obviously, we're talking about the fog of war. Emotions are running high. There's been incredible pain and casualties on both sides, starting with the people of Israel in this attack. Should, with the U.S. involvement, you've mentioned the international community, is one of the actions that being advocated by Human Rights Watch that peacekeepers or some other form of intervention from the international community take place right now?
I think immediately, look, those kind of things are not ever going to, Israel's been resistant always to this idea. They're, to having peacekeepers. I think the immediate priorities, number one, humanitarian aid needs to be allowed in, full stop. Again, where we started the conversation. We are minutes, hours, I can't tell you exactly, away from the hospitals not being able to treat patients. People are already turning to water unfit for human consumption. So we need to get humanitarian aid. Food supplies are running low, number one. I don't think that's controversial to anybody. Shouldn't.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah. I think we need electricity and water and these basic things restored, because even if you get aid in, if you don't have electricity to fuel the power plant, if you can't wash your hands, take showers, you need water for every aspect of everyday life. Those things are straightforward. Third, we need states to just call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. That's not to say you can or can't use force. It just says you must adhere to the standards that are there. Those to me are the starting point for where we start the conversation. Now, is there a solution? We can have a conversation about what a human rights-based solution would look like, but we're so deep in a descent of darkness that it's even hard to conceptualize anything at the time in which those three things seem far away.
One other question, and this may be something you may or may not have monitored, but have you detected a rise in either anti-Palestinian rhetoric or anti-Semitic rhetoric, just in general? It certainly, from where I sit, it seems to be more extremist, hate-based rhetoric But I don't know if that's something you've tracked or have some figures around.
Look, I mean, I think we're looking at that. I think it's hard to make a general assessment because we have anecdotes at this point. We
Right.
do know when there have been previous rounds of escalations that it's often coincided with a rise in some cases, anti-Semitism, in some cases, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism or
Yeah.
Islamophobia. We're certainly hearing that. I mean, just yesterday in Chicago, there was a 6-year-old Palestinian boy that was killed in his home in circumstances
Right.
that advocates said was related to what's happening in Israel-Palestine. There certainly have been reports about anti-Semitism in different areas as well. So I think there's a real concern in Europe, in the United States, and other areas. And I think there's some basic points here. We need to respect obviously the peaceful right of people to protest, but at the same time, we need to be vigilant. Anytime you are attacking a synagogue because of the actions of the Israeli government, that's anti-Semitism. There's no justification. Anytime you're attacking a mosque or a Palestinian at its home or a Jew at their home because of the actions of a government, that's racist and that needs to stop. So I think
Yeah.
there's some basic rules that if we apply, it would take us a long way.
Okay. Thanks very much for joining us, Amar. And of course, a tough situation and a conversation that will be continued. I appreciate your perspective.
Thank you for having me.